Now, I want to invite 4 special people on stage fairly quickly because, you know, Tony Shepherd's got to get back to a board meeting and I've got to get him in and out and I've got to get him bluing in between. Please all join us. We've got the panel that must be obeyed. Starting with, in no particular order, I forget the alphabeticals, but I can see Lucy first. Lucy Turnbull, who's in a safari suit ready for action today. I thought it was fantastic. The now Urbanist, Philanthropist, business person, formerly Lord Mayor of Sydney, formerly Regional Chief of the Greater Sydney Commission. Tim Williams, formerly head of the Committee for Sydney. I noticed his successor, Gabriel Metcalf's with us as well today. The ARUP guru, formerly head of the, you can all come up, formerly head of the Thames Gateway, our sister sibling region in East London, and now simply a dishevelled genius, big thinker of Sydney. Lindy Deitz, as previously described as the tiger of the southwest, but the chief executive of the city of Campbelltown, who keeps reminding us Whitlam made up a promise and we ought to start delivering on Campbelltown, and a fearless advocate for the region. And Tony Shepherd, I haven't got time to read Tony's bio out, but if he's not chairing it, it's not worth chairing. And before he ascended to his portfolio career, a diplomat originally, a Victorian originally, and the long-term boss of Transfield. We got these guys on stage because they can all, you know, throw off being polite, being sensible. We're going to talk about some of the big issues. And if we as a region are going to be taken seriously, we've got to not be afraid to have some of the tough debates. Not everything is wonderful in Western Sydney. It's not all just one big boom town. There's still 25% youth unemployment in corners of it. There's still massive advantage, disadvantage, tyrannies of distance, the teething problems of a greenfields, the retro problems of a central zone, etc., and how we make all this happen. So this is going to be a regular part of the dialogues Boomtown, and next year we'll find 4 more, you know, I was going to say grumpy old men, but they're not all, but they're contrarians, all of them, prepared to speak. So let's get into it. I've only given them a bit of highlight of what I want to talk about and a few things I haven't raised with them at all, so we can freshen it up. Let's go right to the very heart of Western Sydney. Some would say it's not a very thick economy. We've got a government infrastructure and private residential development playing too much of the Western Sydney economy, particularly the Western City economy, which is often the case in growth areas. But can it go beyond that? Let me start with Tony. Tony, the role of government in curating communities, curating business. You've got a distinguished business background, the former chairman of the Business Council, but also experience in government. While we want to get the private sector back in, the government's now going to help us set up economies to go beyond those 2 pillars, to thicken it out to agribusiness and defence and advanced manufacturing. Is that reasonable, or are we kidding ourselves? Oh
no, I think that's the way to go. I mean, housing and basic economic infrastructure are not the end of the game. I mean, they're the start of the game, and they're enablers of what we want, which is private sector investment, creating jobs, long-term sustainable jobs, so that the people of Western Sydney don't have to travel an hour each way or an hour and a half each way each day to get to work. And this is economically and environmentally the sensible way to go, and socially the right way.
Serious companies like the ones you chair seriously going to set up main operations in remote locations, or is getting them out of Pitt Street going to be way too hard?
I think COVID-19 has shown us a lot, hasn't it? There's a lot of sympathy now for being not downtown, but in fact moving out of town, and we've shown through COVID-19 we can do that efficiently, we can do it economically, and I think that pattern is quite dramatically changing. And we've seen with the Aerotropolis in particular, amazing level of interest from overseas, major companies, high-tech companies, who would love to set up businesses in Western Sydney in the parkland.
Perfect segue. Mr Hitoshi from Sumitomo Mitsui Bank is here today, which is, I think, has a balance sheet the same as Australia's. So it's not a bad company. Mike Murdoch from NEC Australia and his team, those companies have come in. But Tim Williams, when you're in London and you're looking at Canary Wharf, an area that probably had too much private sector as opposed to our Sydney Olympic Park with too much public sector, there was a bigotry. The English banks weren't going to come, were they? It was the foreign banks who adopted Canary Wharf.
I mean, I think we can't forget the time we're in. Now, if you go to Canary Wharf now, it's a bit of a ghost town. because of the crisis. It didn't turn out to be as sustainable as we'd thought, and I think that's the place we should start this conversation, it seems to me. The number of business models we've got used to that are crumbling in front of our eyes, and I don't think we know. I think humility is really required. A rare commodity in my career, people I know will say, but essentially things like tall towers, do we want those anymore? Universities, what's their future? Migration, where's all that going? CBDs, retail, the future of retail, public transport. You know, in the 19th century, a famous philosopher that I'm not allowed to mention because people might think I have the same politics, said that the thing about markets was that all that's solid melts into the air. And I think that we've just confronted a massive shift.
I'm so excited you said
society.
that, because Rob Stokes went an entire interview and didn't mention a European philosopher, and that's a record. So I'm glad you rebalanced the equation.
He names the books he reads. I'm slightly more generic than that. But I think the debate is not just about Western Sydney. It's about the city model going forward, and then Western Sydney's role within that. We're at a big moment of departure from models that we thought were locked in.
Lucy Turnbull, your former favourite second city, or a place you spent a fair bit of time as First Lady, I left that off your profile, was Canberra. It's the last time we tried one of these, invent a city out of a cow paddock. We did it, started in the 20s in Canberra. It took them 100 years to get a good coffee in Canberra, right, to want to go out on a Saturday night. Have we got 100 years to make the Western City as cool as we'd like it to be, or is there ways we can learn from Canberra and shortcut?
Well, I mean, can I just say in the last 15 or 20 years or so, Canberra has become what I would say one of the coolest and most livable small cities in Australia. The other one, I think, is actually Newcastle. They're both kind of really booming within easy, driving distance of Sydney, not for the day, obviously, but for longer periods. So we have got two really good examples of where you retrofit livability into an existing urban area, and I think one of the chief kind of criteria or indicators of success in a city is actually walkability. It did take Canberra 100 years to get the idea that you should be able to walk from one place to another, and that was a massive breakthrough. In the central city and the western city, we've actually got to build that out really quickly, and we've got to design around walkability, which means you will need trees for tree canopy, because nobody's going to walk in 35-degree heat if you're going to be cooked in the sun. And you also need a water supply which can support the trees, because trees need water certainly when they're young and establishing themselves. So we've got to do very simple and basic things which sound much easier to deliver than in fact they really are. It means you've got to resort the way utilities are delivered, resort the way infrastructure is identified and I guess paid for up front, so that there can be investment certainty.
Is the cool only organic? Can governments, or can we help curate cool? I don't mean temperature cool, I mean cool. I
think cool cool's about, at the end of the day, it's about the urban design canopy, and it's about the people. So you need and Lindy is full bottle on this. You can speak very expertly about this after me, I'm sure. But cool is a whole lot of things. Cool is a cocktail. It's space, it's walkability, cycling, it's jobs, a range of jobs, not needing to get into a car to go everywhere. And if the pandemic's taught us one thing, it's the importance of walking and the importance of access to local centres.
Lindy, should Northern Beaches get a $10 billion freeway if they're not prepared to cop people to live there, growth in residents? Should the people of Campbelltown watch the people of Avalon cop the road when you're copping the housing?
Well, that's self-explanatory, really, CB. I would actually... Western Parkland City, I just want to take a step back before I answer your question. We're already attractive. We're already cool. You're cool.
I'm cool.
You know, we are a naturally beautiful place. We've got rivers, we've got beautiful botanic gardens, we've got national parks.
You're about to have a billabong.
We're about to have an amazing billabong in the heart of our CBD. And yes, we deserve the infrastructure. But what I think is really important for government is to invest and urbanise in those existing places that have it. So we talk a lot about the Aerotropolis. I think it's really important to invest in the existing metropolitan city centres that surround that airport and that Aerotropolis. They already exist. They've already got the major infrastructure of hospitals, railway lines. They've got the bones of what is needed. So it's a better value for government to invest in those places, to give them the and I think it's more than just roads, because what our communities need is the local employment opportunities. The roads is part of it, but it's actually what we're trying to create is our people not needing to leave the Western Parkland city. That does need roads because we need to rely on each other.
You're not just a dormitory for the Eastern City.
No, it can't be. I think that our communities suffer a less quality of life because of the amount of travelling they have to do for jobs. 3,000 people leave Campbelltown every day to work for state government.
So it's got to rankle a bit when it said Whitlam and Tommy Wren made a promise in the early 70s that Macarthur would be the original. Back before we had precincts, Macarthur was the original growth precinct of Australia. Have you been let down for the past 40 years by successive governments in living up to that promise?
Let me answer that by giving you an example. Minister Stokes just announced that Greenfields gone out on public exhibition today. I would hazard a guess that we have waited 10 years for that announcement. The railway corridor strategy was probably developed, if not pretty close to 10 years ago. And we are finally seeing the urbanisation of one of the most strategic centres. Now, bear in mind that Glenfield's on the East Hills line. It's 30 minutes to Sydney Airport. It'll be 20 minutes to the Western Sydney Airport. And we're getting 7,000 homes. Now, yes, I'm delighted that we're there. I'm disappointed in the yield. I think that's a very disappointing outcome for a place that has such enormous potential. But yeah, we have had to wait a very long time for the urbanisation of our railway corridor.
Throw it to Lucy and Tim as the planners on the panel. We have, let's compare Olympic Park and Oran Park. We're about to, I think, looks like we're in the throes of opening up a whole lot more of Wilton and Appin for more broadacre land release, more Harrington Parks, more anything. Why in God's name are we going to, I grew up in Dundas when it was the equivalent in those days, back in the 70s when we were on the urban fringe in Parramatta and Old Orchards. Why are we going to condemn another generation of outer Sydney-siders to no parks, no trees, no trains? Why aren't we building high-rise in Olympic Park or downtown Campbelltown and we're still doing broadacre land release 50, 60 kilometres, 70 kilometres from the current centre of town and even from the new centres we're projecting?
Chris, you know I mentioned that I was going to try and be humble. I'm going to give you an exercise in humility. Look, placemaking is quite difficult, and I think one of the geniuses of having the Greater Sydney Commission and makes Sydney unique is that there was a serious attempt to do the kind of cross-government collaboration that leads to better placemaking, because it isn't just a private sector obligation. So I think that we've been on a journey to do better placemaking, and I'm more confident than I would have been 5 or 6 years ago that we know the principles and the planning approach. The issue then is still about getting all the bits of the public sector lined up to kind of agree with that vision. I think the second thing...
Why don't we de-zone the green zone?
Say it again?
De-zone the green belt.
Downside.
Green belt, down zone, change the zoning. Melbourne did it controversially years ago. The green belt around Melbourne was controlled.
I would say personally, I am worried that one of the tools we have not given ourselves is not just to encourage the right growth, but to suppress growth in places that it shouldn't be. And we haven't been activist enough, I think, on that. By the way, I was astonished to hear that from the earlier conversation with Chris and the Minister that there were people near the Western Sydney Airport that hadn't made money from their land. That is a big news story, I think.
Lucy, to that point,
well,
I know you and I want to knock down the stuff around Westmead to take
Well, you and I
there.
have a dream to make the land between Hawkesbury Road and Parramatta Park into the Upper West Side of New York, like that. And I think that's actually probably achievable in the longer term if you have a dream of how to get there, because it's a fact that I think it's still a fact. It was a couple of years ago that there are more PhDs per capita in and around Parramatta and Westmead than any other part of Sydney. the level of intense brain capacity in that part of Sydney and the central Sydney is often, I think, underestimated and undervalued. So
when I left Parramatta, the
get our
averages
heads
went
around
up.
that. And I do have a preference, I have to say, to build out existing metropolitan centres like Campbelltown, which is amazing, and there's so much development potential there. It's got this beautiful blend of early 19th century heritage, cultural things like the Campbelltown Art Gallery. One of the most fun days I had at the GSC was actually Lindy taking me around everything at Campbelltown. It's an amazing part of the world, and the Campbelltown Council has a wonderful vision of how to get there. But this can be a challenge. This is a new paragraph, not what Lindy was doing. It's a challenge, and we didn't recommend any new growth areas be created when we were doing our plans in 2015, because there was a new growth area to the southwest of Campbelltown, the MacArthur growth area, which was put in the plan of 2014, the plan for growing Sydney, which is I think 2013. But anyway, it was I think 2013 or 14, which actually triggers a whole lot of consequential land use changes without necessarily doing the planning around the implications of those changes. So build out what we've got, have a preference for more jobs, more houses in places like Campbelltown and Penrith and Liverpool, which truthfully are jewels, and they are for people, unlike people in this room who know the Western Sydney area well, really amazing jewels. But you've got to get the urban planning right, you've got to have the tree canopy, you've got to cool a lot of the areas because the temperature differential is very material in summer. You've got to address that, you've got to address water scarcity for, greening lawns, greening verges, making trees grow. So there's a whole lot of complexity, but I'm totally with the idea of intensifying the land use of existing settlement areas.
I want to pick at an old scab to get the group going, and that sends me towards motorways. We've saw I loved Andrew Constance finally said after 5 years, will you give us an announcement of Boomtown? So we gave a speeches link. But you did point out there'd be a lot of Westies working on building the road, so I saw the link within. Tim and Tony, is it pure inner-city lefty thought to think about active transport in Western Sydney? If I grew up West, you had to drive everywhere. You drove to your car. I mean, you can't walk anywhere. You're getting burned or mugged, to walk around, and that's changing.
Look,
is it a roads future, a rail future? Is it both? Is it?
I think you've got to cater for all ages and sizes and health conditions. But, I think like this driving your children to and from school every day has just got completely out of hand.
Yeah.
Child obesity is on the rise. I mean, we walked a mile to and from school every day from the day I was 5 years old with my older sister. We were all lean, like greyhounds, Not anymore, but I still try and run 5k a day, but I miss most days. So I think that that's important. But you've also got to look at where people live, where they want to live, and I think we've got to remember the words of Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect of the 20th century. The city is not the citizen; it's the other way around. And cities have got to be designed to suit what the people want. And the social planners mightn't like what the people want. Well, that's irrelevant in my view. The demographic of Western Sydney is mum and dad and 2 kids and a mortgage between 500 and $1 million. They want a house. They want a house, give them a house. Do what Lucy said, design them properly, put in plenty of green, make sure that the place has got water, it's comfortable to live in, that we lower the temperature in the suburbs. By the way, everybody living downtown in an intense environment is far more hotter than living in a suburb. I can tell you that now. And I'll tell you what we're finding out in COVID-19, would you rather be in a high-rise flat doing your Zoom call or in a nice house in a garden doing your Zoom call? I know where I'd rather be. In fact, when I do conference calls now, I go out and do the weeding in the garden while I'm on the conference call. Usually that's more productive than the call, but... So we've got to turn this on its head. What does the citizen want? I know we're living in a planned society now, and we have a doctrinaire centre, and that's popular throughout the world. But go with what the people want. They're sensible people. They're fair people. They have aspirations. Give them what they want, but
Lindy, what
plan
your
it
people
and
want?
put it in the right place, and definitely have more intense development around transport nodes. Makes a great sense. Certainly older people would probably be happier and not in a big house, in a more condensed development with all the services they require, but design them and operate them in an ecologically sensible way.
So, Chris, I knew that your desire to set Tony and I at each other was bound to fail, and I knew it was bound to fail, partly because of what Tony said at the start, which I think we all have learned over the last few years, is that there's a real merit to having structured a city that enables a lot more active transport. So, for example, part of the reason why there's actually been more obesity and diabetes in Western Sydney is there's less walkable precincts than the east. That is, I think, pretty demonstrable. So I think nobody on the table is going to say, let's not do that, let's just carry on. I think we're all trying to say, how do you make sure, right? Now, the second thing I think is, I was up for a big picture conversation about whether or not COVID is resetting some of our priorities and some of our cultural preferences. And I listed many of them, by the way, including what the future of an airport might be. So this is a very big moment of discussion where I don't think some of the models from before worked. The difference between roads and rail in structuring a city needs to be understood. Road tends to disperse development, residential and economic, and rail tends to concentrate it. That has been why people like me have supported mass transit and public transport, not because we're greenies, but because it underpinned a rational understanding of how modern cities work. The problem,
I'd be much more supportive
the
of
last thing,
Wilson
though,
about
the
a
last thing
train.
for all of us, sorry, the last thing, is that my list, tall towers, where are they now? Students, migration. I mean, Australia's business model, right, is in some question. I think it's got tremendous offer going forward, but, you know, Sydney grew by 90,000 a year, not this year. Melbourne by 125,000 a year, not this year. What does that do to our plans?
Lindy, one for you. This town, I've got two last big questions for you. In this town, if you're not in a precinct, you better get yourself to one, because that appears to be all the government cares about.
I'd go with in Glenfield. If it's 20 minutes from one airport and 30
Yeah.
minutes from the other, I
Good
reckon it's
spot.
going to be a hot spot.
I agree, and I actually agree.
Glenfield, here we come.
I agree with Lindy's point that as a dwelling aspiration of 7,000 dwellings on the junction of those key rail lines it's interesting. I'll put it politely.
Yes.
I think it's
Don't-
silly.
don't-
Lindy,
don't start.
Campbelltown, you're in the you're in the western city, but you're on the Aerotropolis. Bankstown's in the central city, but it's not in Parramatta Westmead. How do we take government's commitment to precincts and make it the whole cities? How do you stretch? How do you get? Is it just the train links? How do you get a bit of that action? How do precincts not become an absolute obsession of government, but the city they're meant to serve stretched?
Look, I'd have to say that what the Greater Sydney Commission did, and I really uphold it, is the, I guess, creating the visions of areas. So for us, the Western Parkland City has become very real to us as a group of 8 local government areas. And through the City Deals experience, we have created incredible collaboration and understanding of each other's area so that we are now behaving as a region. We're behaving as a district, a region, whatever you want to describe it. But we know each other's strengths. We know what each other needs. And we're actually trying to work collaboratively with state and federal government to achieve those visions and desires. Now,
Just Campbelltown and Camden working together is interesting. So.
I beg your pardon?
Just Campbelltown and Camden working together is a breakthrough.
Macarthur's the best place in the world. I mean, what are you talking about? Macarthur's made up of the fastest growing LGA in Australia, a semi-rural growing area, and then Campbelltown, the best city in the world. So, I mean, you really couldn't ask for anything more, really.
But isn't the problem that a place like Camden has been growing at something like amazing, like 5 or 6% population a year, but the jobs have been growing about 1 or 2%?
Yeah, no, look,
That's
local
still the problem
employment.
for me.
Yeah. Look, Tim, that local employment is our greatest challenge. But again, I go back to the metropolitan city centres. You've already got massive, fantastic hospitals that government have invested in, where the second stage of expansion of Campbelltown Hospital will generate 1,700 jobs. So let's not walk away from the fact that government's put some fantastic infrastructure investment there. But can I just take the luxury of commenting on
Brief luxury, yes.
Sorry, did you say briefly?
A brief luxury because there's a clock yelling at me.
Oh, okay, all right, super fast. What Tim said I find really interesting, because we did an exercise. It's very hard to be quick when you're talking about reimagining Campbelltown, but we did an exercise where we were really brave and we actually went to the community and said, what do you want? Exactly what Tim's saying. And prior to COVID, it'd be fair to say I was a little bit nervous, because they actually said, we don't want the towers. We don't want the towers in Campbelltown. We love our green environment. Do the urbanisation, but do it in a way that you're preserving who we are. And now post-COVID, well, not post-COVID, but where we've landed now, I celebrate that, because I actually think we've landed in the right place and we're listening to our people, more importantly. But I have to really applaud the Department of Planning and the work they've done with streets as shared spaces. All of those concepts are making our areas more beautiful and more livable.
Got to cut you off, you're being too nice. Tony, you've got to go. Tony's got to go and chair one of his 73 companies he chairs in a minute this afternoon, and it's at Macquarie Bank, so it really matters. Are you comfortable? I spoke about getting the private sector back in the game. The government's taken us through COVID, but they've also shut us out in a lot of ways, with PPPs on the wane, value capture's not happening, unsolicited bids are a nightmare, etc., etc. Are you comfortable this city can recalibrate the probity versus progress?
Well, I hope so, because the private sector provides 80% of the jobs. And so without the private sector growing jobs in Sydney, in Greater Sydney, or growing jobs in the Western Parkland City, is not going to happen. You can't have all public service jobs. We must get private investment into Western Sydney.
The GSC
Absolutely.
led almost a revival of probity auditing. Was a probity audit-led economic recovery, Lucy, when you were there. Does it kill your innovation?
Look, during the Great Depression, one of the things that the government did then was build a lot of infrastructure. We've got concrete roads all over Sydney that were built during the Great Depression. But when we took off after the war, Second World War, it was the private sector that did the investment, and that created the jobs, which gave us the prosperity we enjoy today. So, you know, I think what the government's doing now is the right thing. I think the stimulus and putting it into sensible projects which will benefit it in the future are great, but then the private sector's got to pick it up once COVID has passed.
Lucy, you gone back to being a private investor from being a regulator. Are you comfortable that your view can still be put in without the need for 73 forms to be filled in?
Well, that's always kind of say, when you see things like, dare I mention the word Leppington Triangle, I'm sure it's been mentioned before, that actually makes you super cautious about having any direct conversation with people who could be seen to be, you know, trying to get you to do something. And that is the complexity of being in government. Can I just tell you that actually being out of government has its own particular advantages and attractions. Because, and can I say that that the work that government officials do to deliver a good city, to deliver jobs, to deliver livability, to deliver green spaces and connectivity should never be underestimated or undervalued, and they're constantly being criticised, and I think a lot of the time that criticism is totally unjustified. So it's not a walk in the park being a public official, and I take my hat off to the people actually who do it, because sometimes it can be tough.
Last question for you, Tony Shepherd, you're the oldest on the panel. Who wins the flag versus the Eels or the Giants?
It's a no-brainer. The Giants, the Eels are hopeless.
Finally, we got some good at the end. Would you please welcome 4 people who've not only made a magnificent contribution in their day job, who continue to think big about a region, who shouldn't be afraid to have tough debates about that region if we're going to be taken seriously. Lucy Turnbull, Tony Shepherd, Lindy Deitz, Tim Williams. Thank you.